I'm still using the Google form to answer questions. Now, if everyone here has never used the Google form, I won't use it. We can just answer whatever questions that exist. If you're comfortable asking them, well, if not, then Brother Salam can give you the Google form link, and you can just write it, and I can read it myself and answer it, inshallah. So either way, should be okay. I think probably none of you have ever used the Google form before. Maybe you use it. I think you have. I think I know the question that you put as well. Yeah, I'm that good. All right. So are there any questions that I would like to ask before? You want to go throw one? Go ahead. Sure. Okay. Does anyone else want to try something? Yeah, go ahead. Go.
I was wondering if you could touch on the prohibition on face striking and whether it applies to sports.
On what? Say again?
Like the prohibition on striking the face.
Sure.
Which comes up in hadith, and whether that applies to sports like boxing and everything.
All right. So I don't think when it comes to sports, the problem is face striking. I think it's the nature of each sport, of the sport itself. We'll kind of talk about whether it's permissible or not in Islam. Face striking in a sense, is prohibited. It was specific to parents, towards children, or to superiors, towards those who are in their care. Like if you're caring for someone, and physical punishment is for some reason there or going to be used, then striking on the face is completely haram. You never do that. But sports, it's not like that anymore. Like in a sport, we're not talking about they're not slapping it. It's not slapping each other in a sport. There's a purpose to it. The problem with the sport would be, is it harmful? See, that's the question that you need to ask. So when it comes to boxing, for example, Islam has a problem with boxing because boxing is actually, even from a scientific perspective, a medical perspective, is actually very, very harmful to those who are boxing. And we've seen it so many times in history now that I don't understand why the learning curve is so slow. Like so many boxers have been diagnosed with so many different neurological diseases throughout history. It's kind of funny that we don't, we're not. There's so much money in it, I guess. I think the money is what kind of dictates its survival this long. So when it comes to a sport, I don't think it's a striking in the face that's a problem. It's more, is the sport harmful to the body and to the psyche, or is it not? If it's not, then that's fine, whatever the sport is. And if it is, then that's becomes haram. The striking in the face, the hadith that we do have, is kind of talking toward, is geared towards parenting or educators or whatever. Because if you've been to any, I don't know if you've been back in the Middle East at any point, then you'll see that is quite physical punishments are much more, I guess, prevalent there than they are here. So there were certain regulations that were put towards at least what can be done. And striking in the face was one of them that was prohibited in haram. But with sports, I think it's a different angle altogether. Does that answer your question? Anything else you'd like to ask? So I'll just go through the forms.
I think I can answer the question.
Sure.
As Muslims, how do we come to, because we live in a secular society, right? So at times it is difficult to just say that we have faith in our religion.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christian people, when you do ask them, like, what moves you towards believing in your faith or whatever, they give you the answer that, okay, I just believe in it, and that's it, like, right? But for us, it's more so yaqeen, right? It's like having that conviction.
Yeah.
How do you explain that to someone from outside of our faith? That what causes us to have that conviction predominant? Or like the primary cause, you're saying?
I think the reason that's the answer that some of our, whether Jewish or Christian brothers and sisters offer, specifically is because in the last maybe 50 or 60 years, there has been this distinction between what is scientific and what is religion. And that and the gap is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where those who want to have faith, they have to say we have faith, has nothing to do with science, we just believe it. And we don't have to have any proof. We don't have to have any science. We don't have to have any evidence. We don't have to. It doesn't have to make any sense. It's just what I believe, and that's the only way they can seem to offer an answer. And there's Muslims in certain places that do the same thing. By the way, it's not just. But as Muslims, like we said, we look at it a bit differently. We don't see it. We don't see that. We don't see that disconnection between what is religious and what is scientific, or how the world works and how religion actually or fundamentally works. So when you answer that question, I think where we take our faith from are from four main sources. You take it, one, from the universe around you. So when you look at the world that surrounds you, and look at all the laws that govern it, there'll never be proof, scientific proof of God. They'll never exist, because science doesn't study God. Science studies what is observed within time and space, and God is beyond time and space. So if science can prove God, then whatever it proved wasn't really God, because that doesn't work anymore. Because now he's contained in time and space, and that's khalas. Time and space are God now, and he's just a creation within it. It doesn't work anymore. So you can never get proof. What you can get is evidence, and there's a difference between proof and evidence. It's not the same thing. Proof is one thing, evidence is a different thing. Evidence are signs, small, little, micro pieces of, or micro conclusions that you add together that point in the same direction, that give you a high probability of a certain concept. Proof is different. Proof is you actually physically being able to, so physically and mentally, by a large number of people, witnessing something. So if you're in a court of law, what is the closest thing that we have to proof? Is someone admits it? So what was the word for it?
Witness.
No, if someone admits the crime, it's a confession. Sorry, a confession, and then and something that's on video with audio. So that's the closest we have to proof. And even then, it's not really proof. It's only evidence, because all three could be easily manipulated. All three there could be mistakes in them, and actually throughout the judicial history, that's been proven to happen so many times that these things now are subjected to so much credibility studies to make sure that this is actually something that we can use in a court of law. So the same thing when it comes to, for us as Muslims, we look at four sources. We look at the universe, we look at life, we look at history, and we look at ourselves. So there's four things that you look at. When you look at all four, they're all pointing in the same direction. When you look at the universe, what are you looking at? Well, we're looking at intelligent design. No, that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at the unity of the laws. In all laws, the universe is governed by all the same laws, all the same materials, whether what we're made of, what the earth is made of, or what the cosmos and the farthest star that we can see is made of. It's all the same star list. It's all the same elements working the same way, the same basic laws governing them. We're still finding out these laws and learning more about them every day, but it's still the same stuff. So whoever made this, if you're going to accept that, it's one. It's not multiple, because it's all the same laws. And then you look at life itself. The fact that life exists, the fact that life evolved in one way or another from something that is lifeless, and that it is given purpose, and that it has an ability it has the metacognition, it has the ability to communicate properly and to think beyond itself. And then you look at history and you see that religion didn't start a few years ago. Since we've known, since human beings have been around, not Homo sapiens, since human beings have been around, since we've been able to write things down on the walls of caves, there has been faith. Every single civilization will differ from the other in many different things, but you always find a temple. And you say there's always going to be a temple. There's always been that faith factor, and there's always been prophets, and there's always been books. The messages may differ. Now, the fact that the messages differ is not the problem. The fact that there's always been a religion brings that there's always been some form of messaging. There's always been some form of communication and some form of belief that exists in society. As Muslims, the way we look at it is that it's always been the same message that's been delivered. However, just throughout centuries, these messages have been changed and manipulated and morphed and turned into something that's a bit different, that doesn't really represent the actual message. And we know that as Muslims because we can see today Muslims who practice Islam totally different than however, and we have the ability to actually see the comparison, because the Quran is saying one thing and then what they're doing is totally different. Well, how did you make this, can you explain how you made this big shift from here to over there, even though the text is right in front of you? So imagine if the text isn't there. Imagine a religion that was revealed at a time when there was no documentation and people had not learned how to do that yet. So you lose a lot of the text once that generation dies off or the second generation doesn't exist anymore. And then you look at yourself and you look into your own heart, into your own experience as a person and your own story of life. And when you put it all together, that's how you build your conviction in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the building of conviction, you use signs from science, you use signs from history, you use signs from life itself, and you use signs from your own experience. And when you have them all, this is what, and that's what the Quran tells you. It says, look, when you read the Quran is filled with the word ayat, right? It's almost everywhere. The word ayat means signs. It doesn't mean verses. 99% of the time it means signs, it doesn't mean verses. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will talk about so you look at the stars, look at the moon, look at plants, look at animals, and so you at the end, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. And within that you will find signs for people who reflect, or people who contemplate, or people who mentate properly. يَعْقِلُونَ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ يُؤْمِنُونَ, those who believe, those who have يُوقِنُونَ, those who have certainty. So the Quran is always telling you, look, you're going to find faith, you're not going to find it within the book. You're going to find it outside of the book. When you find it, come to the book so it'll tell you what to do. Because once you believe in God, then things change. Okay, so now I believe, so what do I do now? So he's there, and this is the story. I'm here for like, what, 90, 80 years, 100 years tops, 100 spins of this earth around the sun, and then I'm gone. So what do I do within these 100 years? You can't find out unless there's some form of guidance. There's no way for, science doesn't tell you who, why, or what. Science tells you how. Science is awesome and how. It tells you how things work. It's the most interesting thing in the world. But it doesn't tell you why. Ask science, why am I here? Doesn't care. What am I supposed to do here? Not even something it looks at. It's not even a part of its curriculum. It doesn't care. Who did this? Not my problem. Science says how things work. Now religion tells you the why, what, and who. Doesn't tell you how. Once we start mixing, the mix is what caused today's generation to really confuse faith. Like they don't understand how to deal with religion because they're looking for the answers in the wrong place. Like they're looking for how from the Quran. If you're trying to understand how life evolved and how creation happened from religion, you're going to get totally mixed up. You're going to think what is figurative is going to be literal, and then you're going to believe that the earth, especially from a biblical or Old Testament and Torah and Talmud perspective, you'll think the world only existed for 6,000, 7,000 years tops, and that's why, because you're looking for how from religion. Religion doesn't tell you how. It's not interested in how. It's not its focus. That's science focus. Religion tells you who did this, why you're here, what you're supposed to do. It gives you those answers. The answers that science is completely not interested in. So I think that's a distinction that we see as Muslims in terms of dealing with faith, because I think that's what it kind of comes down to. Like, you ask the question, but it comes down to that. It comes down, how do we deal with how advanced our understanding of how the universe works from a scientific perspective, with our faith, with our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think that there's 3 or 4 misconceptions in terms of what science can offer, how we're supposed to look at the universe in general. Well, what are we searching for to begin with? Are we searching for proof? If you're searching for proof, I'm sorry to tell you, you're not going to find it. And you're going to end up very... Look, asking science for proof of God is just like walking into Walmart trying to buy a passport. You're in the wrong place. They don't sell that here. A scientist's opinion of God of God's existence is just as good as a pizza maker's opinion of God. Just as good as a mechanic. It's no different because that's not what they study. Of course, scientists are much more knowledgeable within the field that they study. That's not it. You want to know about God? Go study philosophy. When you study philosophy, you find a whole different ballgame. You'll find that philosophers are cut down almost dead in the middle. Actually, with a higher percentage of philosophers throughout history who believed in a deity, in a form of a supreme power that governed the universe. Very few philosophers believed that there was nothing that started this, or there's no intelligent or supreme power that started it. Why? Because philosophers looked at things differently. The philosophy of science is different than science itself. They don't say the same thing, and they don't come to the same conclusions. So I think it's just this one big misconception that was started maybe, I think justifiably so, within the last couple of centuries, because of all the wars and all the corruption and problem that happened within religious institutions, caused people to rebel against it. But they rebelled against it to the point where they discredited the whole concept to begin with, just because a lot of religious leaders and speakers within the last maybe 2 centuries of being corrupt doesn't mean that the whole concept has to be thrown into garbage. That makes no sense at all. That's not how we deal with. That's not how you objectively deal with any thought. You don't judge it by those who end up carrying the torch of it for a certain period of time and then decide to discredit it, because the same thing exists within science. Meaning there's been more fraud within science than there has been in religion. However, we don't discredit science for it, we discredit religion for it. But why? Because religion, those who carry it, claim to be ethically more sound. And when they don't, that bothers everyone, and then you rebel against it. So it is a delicate and difficult thing to deal with, but I think I hope that gave you an understanding of what I think the answer is. Anything else that you would like to ask verbally? Go ahead.
Kind of along those same lines, so once
Sure.
you get past that and then you get to the Quran, how do you know that is the true and real
Sure.
God?
Sure. So if you believe in God to begin with, meaning you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Supreme Being, is there, the question after that is, do you believe that He has communicated, or that the deity has tried to communicate with human beings? When you look through history, you find that the communication has been consistent. It's time after time after time after time, every single civilization, every single group of people have had prophets at some point or the other within their existence that have brought messages. Some of those messages have been verbal, some of them have been written, but they always have the same thing. So the Quran is not breaking a rule that didn't exist previously. It's not coming with something that we've never heard of this before. No, the Quran actually says, I am the continuation of all the previous books that God sent to all the different prophets. I'm here to increase the belief in those books and to bring the same message that those books brought. So that's one thing, that you have to understand the continuation. If you believe in the Quran disconnected from everything before it, then yes, you will find that it will be very difficult to understand it, or you'll fall into a problem that some Muslims today have fallen into. Maybe they've disconnected themselves to the house of Abraham, for example. Islam is an Abrahamic faith, meaning that it's one of the faiths that Musa, all the children of Abraham have brought in. So when you study Ibrahim alayhi salam, you look at all his children, all the prophets that descended from him, there are many. Judaism and Christianity are two Abrahamic faiths, and so is Islam. So when you look at Islam, you have to see that it's connected to the same storyline that is bringing that was brought by Abraham alayhi salam. Does that mean there are no other prophets around the world? Of course there were. Every single part of the world has had pockets of prophets, and it's a matter of you go studying a bit of the history of religions, and you'll see it exists everywhere. In Japan, in India, and in China, South America, they've all had prophets, and they all had religions. It's just that it wasn't all preserved the same way the Quran was. So that's one thing. Second thing is the preservation of the Quran. The Quran doesn't have different versions to it. It's one book. It's the same version that existed for 1400 years. It hasn't been manipulated. So what you're reading today is what Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam 1400 years ago was actually what he brought to people. Now you move after that, you move into the content of the Quran. So the content of the Quran is what actually you benefit from the most, or what solidifies the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the message that the Quran carries, the value, and the ethics and the morals that the Quran brings forward in terms of practice, in terms of belief, and in terms of human morality. So when you look at all three, it kind of brings forward the understanding that you need in terms of believing in the Quran. But the Quran itself doesn't say in it, it doesn't tell you that you're going to believe in God through it. It tells you you'll believe in God from outside of it. And then once you believe in God, you will find nowhere else to go but to it. And you'll come back, because you'll be searching for the message. Because if you believe in God, you can't, it makes no sense to say, it's senseless to say that I believe in a God that is communicative, but he didn't say anything. And I don't know what he wants. That makes no sense. If you're going to believe in a deity, you can believe that in fact that it communicates with his creations, which it does. Isn't DNA a form of communication on its own? The fact that life is all recorded in every single cell of the body, like all of life. Most of your DNA doesn't do anything; it just sits there. It's just a record. It's like an archive room. Like no one goes there because this is old stuff. This probably has parts where the fruit fly was once the only dominant species, or when trees were the only thing. So it's an archive. God he communicates. He communicates differently. He codes things. The DNA is the biggest example, and the best the software programmer in the world couldn't imagine programming something or coding something as delicate and as accurate as what DNA brings forward. So if we know that God communicates, then the question is, okay, how did he communicate? And then you start looking and you find historically that there has been a consistent movement of communication, and the Quran doesn't claim to be different or to be something that is outside of the normal flow and continuation of all faiths before it. All the Quran says is two things. One is that it's been preserved. So what you're reading is what actually was said. There's no change to it. We know for a fact that the Bible was not preserved. Like that's something that they debate a lot, but it's known that there's a lot of different versions of it. When you're arguing with, or you're debating, or you're discussing with a priest, or from any evangelical or a Catholic or a Protestant, when you talk to them, they have different versions of the Bible that they claim to be sacred, and that's what they look at. But that doesn't change the fact that there are many other versions that other Christians also see to be different. So we know that it was not preserved perfectly throughout the flow of history. Again, that's not, we're not blaming people for that. It's just what happened. The same thing goes to the Torah and the Talmud, that it wasn't all preserved. And the Quran was the second thing. Sorry.
I have a question about that, about the preservation. I'm really sorry if I'm butchering these.
No, it's fine.
But there was, apparently in 637,
Sure.
maybe, there was a revision, the Islamic revision, I think is how you would pronounce it, where
Sure.
copies were standardized. So that would mean that it can't be possible that the original has been preserved all the way if there's been a standardization.
Sure. Okay, so that's not what happened at all. So what happened was, by the time the Prophet ﷺ died, the Quran was written, but it wasn't written in one book because there was no paper at the time. There weren't notebooks you could buy from a place, so you just would take whatever you could write on. So they would have different slates that the Quran was written on by those who were there when the Quran was written. So each verse was written by 4 to 10 people on separate slates, and the Sahaba memorized it. That's another part that is dropped from a lot of the historical studies of it. That the Quran is memorized, meaning it's from mouth to mouth. It's not just from paper to paper. What happened during the Uthmani or Uthman radiallahu anhu, his reign of when he ruled, is that because a lot of the Sahaba, a lot of the companions started to pass away, they were getting older, and those who had memorized the Quran. So what he did was he had all the slates being put together and written in a book that had like you could open the pages and look into it. So it was written. So 7 different copies of it were written and sent to the different parts of the Muslim empire. Because by the time Uthman was ruling, the Muslim empire was quite large. It was. In the west, it arrived to Tunisia, and in the east, it arrived to the beginnings of India. And in the south, it had already been into Somalia and Sudan. In the north, it had already into Turkey. So now it was you're talking over 2 million people. At the time, that was a big deal because there was only 8 million people on the planet to begin with. So what he did was he had the slates brought together, and there was like a very clear criteria in terms of how the Quran was going to be written. It was given to 2 people to take care of the actual transferring what's written on the slates to the Quran. You had to have 2 people who wrote it from the Prophet ﷺ's mouth. So when the Prophet ﷺ recited the Quran for the first time, you had to have 2 people there who had written it, and they had their slates, and it had to be something that everyone agreed to be as a memorized concept. I mean, even if it's written, if let's say the companions are sitting, you guys know this ayah or this verse, and they said, no, we've never heard this verse before, it wouldn't stick. So they had a very clear step-by-step method in terms of preserving it and writing it. All that happened is instead of having different slates all over the place, it was all put in one book, and then that book, 7 copies were made of it and sent, and everything after that was burnt. I mean, everything that was left was just disposed of, but that was burnt was the source of what was written. It's not the idea, like what they wrote, this was the source of it. But there were certain people who had written the Quran on their own. Like there's 4 or 5 of the companions who throughout the time, because they were memorizing the Quran word for word, they wrote the Quran themselves. Like they made their own book, which had mistakes in it because they were doing it based on their own experience. So this time everyone came together, took all the slates, everything that existed, and they put it all together, and then everything else was disposed of so that there would be no more disagreement in terms of what actually exists. The Quran, but most importantly, the Quran was memorized. It's different from other books within that one specific detail. That it's not just the fact that it was written on paper, the fact that it was actually memorized word for word. Today, in the world today, there is around 39 to 41 million Muslims who memorize the Quran word for word from the beginning to the end of it. 604 pages with around 6,632 verses in it. And it's been memorized and it's been carried down through memorization in addition for it to be written. For the argument of the original Quran to be different, you would have to have evidence. There had to be evidence that some manipulation had happened during the time of that transfer. We have no evidence of that manipulation happening because all the companions who were around at the time, with the slates that were written, had worked together in terms of transferring it from the slates to actually the written Mus'haf. And none of the companions who later on weren't there, when they saw the version, objected to something in it and said, "There's nothing here that that there's something here that I don't know about, or there's something that I know about that is missing in the Quran." I mean, it was something that was agreed to by all the companions, not a majority of them. So there was no companions who came out in history during the actual collection and putting together of the Quran, or after that complained that this is not what we learned. However, there are different recitations of the Quran. Recitations is different. It's not the same as version. Version means that there will be a chapter missing or chapter added. All the different recitations of the Quran, and the Sahaba, the companions were very clear in terms. They weren't scared. They would say what they had to say. So they recited the Quran the way they learned it, even if they differed with someone else heavily on the way the word is going to be said. They still did it anyway because that's how they learned it. So we have around altogether 1,000 ways to read the Quran. to pronounce it in terms of pronunciation. But none of those 1,000 ways has an extra verse or a minus verse or a changing verses or an extra chapter or a less chapter. It's all this. It's the same text from beginning to end. So the way the Quran was preserved was two ways. It's through memorization and pronunciation, meaning it has a style of reading. It's not, you can't read the Quran like you read a standard Arabic. That makes it, there are actually laws of how you're going to say certain letters and how many counts you have to give for a vowel, and what type of noise has to come out when you say the M, the letter M or the letter N. So there's a very strict law in terms of how you're supposed to read it. So it was preserved through memorization because there was a law to read it, and then it was preserved through documentation. It was documented during the time. But the argument of it being changed during that transfer, I don't know any evidence for it. Like I don't know what the evidence behind or to support that is. I mean, to say that, oh no, it was changed from the slates that was written on and the memorization of the companions when it was put into the book. I don't know what evidence exists of this being different from what actually exists, because those who memorized the Quran were still there and they approved what was written and they didn't have any objection to what was there. Because all it was just a transfer from different, it's like you're writing notes and you have 50 papers and you take it and you write it into a book that you can actually now, you publish it. Now it's publishable, you can send it and people can use it. And these books were the only, these Qur'ans were the only ones that existed at the time. If you wanted to have something written, you would have to go to where it existed, stand in line, and then copy it from what was written. And if you copied it wrong, there were enough people to tell you that you made a mistake here, because it's not just based on writing, it's also based on memorization. I myself memorized it when I was a kid. Brother Salman memorized it himself. So it's actually quite common that Muslims memorize the whole thing from the beginning, from A to Z. Does that answer your question in general?
Yeah, it sounds like there could still be small deviances, though pretty similar to, I guess, a lot of the other scriptures for
Sure.
different religions too. I found something else, this was about
Sure.
200 years later, where there were deviants that were boiled in vinegar to dispose of them. It says, I think, kidney was involved in that. I don't know if that's something that is
Sure.
kind of out there. I also found that there's a manuscript in Yemen that I think you mentioned that the Quran had been written on animal skins
Sure.
at points, where they've found that you can tell from the writing that it's been washed and rewritten. So it sounds like I agree that the overall transmission sounds like it's been pretty accurate, but it sounds like you can't claim that it's like 100% the same way that Muhammad would have had it written down.
Well, when you say that there was a manuscript that was written then washed, how do we know that that was written by someone who was sitting with the Prophet? How do you know how far that dates back to begin with? You see, when someone brings forward an old piece of paper, look, the Quran was written, it doesn't change anything for us at all. We don't know who wrote that. It's not enough for someone to say, look, I have an old piece of paper. No, who wrote it? Who witnessed it being written? So it's like you're investigating something for a case that you have in front of a judge. That piece of paper is completely unacceptable evidence in a court of law, because you don't know who wrote this. You don't know exactly what time it was written. You can say, oh, it's old, it's 1,300 years ago. Fine, but who wrote it? Was it? I don't know. I have no idea who wrote this. So this is completely. I don't need that. This doesn't help me. It doesn't strengthen my case, nor does it weaken my case, because it doesn't. There's nothing there for me to use in terms of evidence whether it was actually like that or not. The only way for you to say that there was a change or a difference is that all of the companions at the time of the Prophet plotted at once that they were going to do it. And that's what we have in Islam, something called tawatur. Tawatur means when you have certainty of transmission because of the large number of people who are transmitting something. So if I'm giving a lecture right now and you listen to what I'm saying, and you go and someone asks you what did he say, you say what you understood. Now, if you say it, and then someone else says, no, that's not what he said, and someone else says, no, that's not what he said, that means probably what was being transmitted, there's a mistake. But if you walk out and you all say the exact same thing, in different places, at different times, exact same thing, then there's a level of certainty that I said it that is almost undeniable. I mean, that stands in a court of law. If you have 15 witnesses from different places that don't have any reason to be plotting together for something, all saying this is what was said, then you can't deny it, just like, or else you have to deny all of history, because most of history, that's how it was transmitted to us. Actually, a lot of history was transmitted through one dude. Just one guy wrote a book, and everyone else died, didn't talk about it. Then you have to accept that this happened based on this one guy saying it happened. And that, for religious evidence doesn't work. But I'll tell you what we do have. We have something called prophetic narrations. Meaning we have things that Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that weren't Quran. Now those ones, we know for a fact that there is a problem of transmission. Then they're 100%. Why? Because it's only one person transmitting from another person. So it's one guy narrating that another guy, saying that another guy, that Aisha, the Prophet's wife, said that the Prophet said this. So this is the chain of narration. It's only one guy per level, right? There's a high level of human error here. Easily one of them could have misheard what was said, right? Or someone could have, made something up. They could have made a mistake. So when we take that prophetic narration, there's a probability of it being 100% true. I mean, what probability do we have that he actually said that, peace be upon him, is 60%, 65% at best. But when we talk about tawatur, which is large group of people transmitting the Quran, if we're going to deny that, we're going to deny basically all of history. We're going to end up with almost nothing, because the Prophet taught the Quran to over 1,000 people. Over 1,000 people learned it, and when the Quran was written in those books, it was in those put into chapters and sent to the different parts of the kingdom. The Sahaba were there to critique it, to say anything if they wanted to say something about it. If they wanted to say this is wrong or this is right, what they would have said. And we don't have anything on record where they're actually saying that. You do have like one Sahabi who said, no, I think that's wrong, but the group is like, no, that's right. Which is normal. He's a human being. He memorized it wrong. I sometimes read the Quran. I forget. I miss a wow, like an and or a but. I'm not sure which one it is because I'm one person. But when the group is all, no, this is, and they have evidence of it being written, that kind of kills the evidence. Certain, I guess, incidents of, see, after that happened, whatever happened in the 200, 300, 400 years later doesn't really matter anymore, because since that Mus'haf has existed, since those 7 Qur'ans were written at the time of Uthman, it's been preserved ever since. Meaning, so I'll give you an example. When I memorize the Quran, I have a chain of narration that takes me back to Muhammad, peace be upon him. So actually, I can say that I have a paper at home. I can show where I say, my teacher says, I read the Quran to him. The way he read it to his teacher, and he names him. The way his teacher read it to his teacher, and he names him. And we keep on going back. There between me and Muhammad are 31 people. Exactly. There's 31 individuals between me and him, because which is 1,400 years. If you think a generation is 50 years, times 50 by 30, that's 1,500. That's basically the time limit. So you can count it back to Muhammad, because that's how it was basically transmitted. The writing only made it easier for people to learn it. Again, the idea of tawad, the idea of large number of people bringing the Quran forward. On the other hand, you have prophetic narrations that was only brought by 1 or 2 people. You can easily, the argument you're using would work for that 100%, and we agree to that anyway. Then a lot of the prophetic narrations aren't 100% true. That's why if you say, well, this is what you have in this book, that the Prophet said this, I don't know if he said that. We think he said that. He may not have said that. Actually, sometimes there are mistakes. And easily it could be something that he most likely did not say, if it's a hadith da'if, if the narration is weak or is not proper. But in the Quran, as far as I can tell from a scientific or a historical perspective, the way that was transmitted through a large number of people, it wouldn't. If I deny it, then I'm denying most of what happened within Islamic history and most of it within human history, because it was narrated through 1 or 2 people at best. One more? No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
So if we go back to the original, then you have one person over the span of about 50 years, I think, writing or verbally conveying the message. Wouldn't something like the Bible have more credibility then, because you've got 2,000 years and like 40-something authors, and they're all in agreement?
But they're not. See, that's the thing. First of all, we know that the Bible wasn't written or verbalized by Jesus. It's what the apostles actually narrate, what they remember or what they memorize. And that's why you have in the book of Luke, the book of Mark, you have different, so not the same. We don't have that. It's one book, it's one scripture, it's one continuation of verses from the beginning to the end of it that was agreed upon by almost everyone who was there. Some companions at the time had passed away, so they weren't there to say anything. But those who were there had all agreed to that, that this is what Muhammad had said word for word, and it was just a matter of continuing the transmission. It was done through 2,000 years, but it wasn't done through scientific transmission, meaning it wasn't one group of people agreeing to a version and then transmitting it to another group of people with the same version. It was different people writing different versions, and then those versions brought together, and they were brought together differently. That's why we have so many different versions of the Bible, based on how it was brought together, at what time it was brought together, what chapters were taken, what were dropped, and what were added to, and what wasn't accepted. We have the different types of Bibles. So, I mean, how many versions of the Bible exist today, in your understanding?
There's like hundreds, but they don't go, well, probably not hundreds,
Yeah.
but
There's 73, basically. That's what
that's not so bad.
Swagger said. Yes, so around 73.
But they don't all vary from one another. They all have come, whenever there's a new translation, they go back to the
Sure.
Greek, right?
To the Greek, yeah.
So it's not like a translation of a translation of
Yeah.
a translation.
But even the Greek itself, it's agreed upon from my understanding that Christian mythologists, they agree that this was not what Jesus said per word. This is what the apostles narrated from him, or said that he said. So that's which makes a big difference.
Which is same as for you guys, right?
No, see, but that's not the same thing. What they're claiming is this is the word for word. This is what he said, peace be upon him, word for word. It was memorized and documented. What on the apostles is a different thing. So the best we can say is that this is what Jesus said, but there weren't enough people at the time to document it and memorize it. So the way that it came to us was there's different opinions. So the way I look at it is that what happened to the Torah, and the Talmud, and the Old Testament, New Testament, was what happened to the prophetic narrations that we have. It's the same. They have the same issue. It's a chain of narration that has one or two people per level, which gives it a certain level of probability, but it doesn't give you 100% certainty that this is exactly what he said. And the Quran was just transmitted differently. It was just much larger number of people bringing forward the exact same version, generation after generation, until the modern day, where everything now is properly written and documented. There's no change anymore. But at the time before printing was invented, it was a big deal. Keeping the transmission alive and keeping the number of people around 1,000 or more. It started with 1,000, then it became much more until today, like in the millions. That's transmitting the same text. So I think there's a difference in terms of how the Talmud, the Torah, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the prophetic narrations that we have were transmitted in comparison to how the Quran. Because we have the same thing we have Abu Hurairah, for example, a companion, and Ibn Abbas, saying the Prophet said this, and they're saying something similar, but it's not the same thing. It's not word for, there's differences here. There's differences that actually can cause different understandings of what's required of us to do. Like, okay, if we're going to take what he said, then we're going to do 1, 2, 3. We take what he said, 3 is out, and there's 4 in here, and there's something different totally together. And we have that, and that's why Islamic jurisprudence is very rich. There's a lot of different variations of what you can do, what you can't do in certain branched out parts of life. However, from the Quran, that doesn't exist. That's not there. There's no, well, this is what Ibn Abbas said in the Quran here, and this is what Abu Hurairah said in the Quran here. No, this is the Quran. This is what the Sahaba agreed to unanimously. This is what they wrote down. This is what was sent to people, and this is what was later on memorized and transmitted continuously.
So it's kind of like a controlled transmission, but a free transmission
Sure.
that agrees would hold even more weight because there isn't, say, for like the Constitution of America.
Sure.
They can say that this is what was written, obviously with much
Yeah.
less time, but that's also that's just for man, right?
Sure.
Like I wouldn't say that the
Sure.
United States Constitution is
Sure.
inspired or anything.
Yeah, but we know that the United States Constitution, that's the way it's written, is the way they wrote those who wrote it. So what we're trying to argue is that what we have is what Muhammad said. Whether it's inspired or not, that's a different argument altogether. Like whether you believe that it was wahi, that it was revelation from God, or that he was just, that's something that you make a choice of to be. What we're talking about is what we have, what Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually said, or is it something that was manipulated later on? To say that it's controlled and not free is not fair either. It was controlled in terms it was organized. But then everyone had free will to talk about what they knew, agreed with their memorization or didn't agree with their memorization. Meaning, people later on had the ability and had the status, all of them did, to say, well, I heard it from him and that's not how I heard it. And yet that didn't happen. Is that the difference here? Like they weren't, people weren't killed off, so they wouldn't. Are you guys starting at 6:30? Is someone waiting outside?
We have a class
Oh,
at 6:30.
6:30. Okay, well, we're done.
Usually I come
Yeah.
here to prep.
Yeah, we're done.